She said, she comes here all the time. She just is anxious. Just put her in the waiting room. And I was like, I don't think so. Something feels so wrong here to me. She just doesn't look right. But this nurse was a stronger personality than me. I felt like I was backed into a corner. And I said, okay, you're going to go in the waiting room. And I just was like a nervous wreck. And you know what? I should have trusted my gut, because that bad advice of putting that person in the waiting room because she was just a repeat customer and was just anxious. She had a PE, she coded, and she died.
Hey there, I'm your host, Sarah Lorenzini, a rapid response nurse and educator who loves telling stories to teach critical thinking. This podcast is for nurses who want the knowledge, skills, and confidence to respond to any emergency. With almost 20 years of experience in the ER and critical care nursing, and a master's degree in nursing education, I have a lot of stories to share, and I love to nerd out and break down the pathophysiology, pharmacology, and nurses' role in emergencies. Stories bring learning to life. It is way easier to learn from and remember the stories that my colleagues and mentors have told me than anything I've read in a textbook. And that is why I made this podcast. Every episode is packed full of exactly what you need to know to handle whatever crisis that could arise on your shift. It's one thing to get the right answer on the test, but knowing how to detect when your patient is declining and what to do when your patient is crashing is what will make or break your day and might just save your patient's life. Welcome back to the Rapid Response Room podcast. Today we're shifting gears just slightly, but in a way I know you're going to love. We're diving into the heart of nursing, leadership, and real-life patient stories with two incredible voices from the American Association of Critical Care Nurses. Joining me are Dr. Vicki Good, the AACN's Chief Clinical Officer, and Andrea Schmitt, AACN's Clinical Practice Specialist. And together, they host the Voices in Nursing podcast. And this isn't just another nursing show. Voices in Nursing amplifies the stories behind the scenes, the split-second decisions and clinical expertise, and the human moments that define the front lines of healthcare. So I'm excited for you to get to meet and hear from them. So Vicki and Andrea, welcome to the Rapid Response Room podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, I'm so excited to talk with you guys. Okay, so let's just dive right in. As a fellow podcast host, I want to know what led y'all to co-hosting a podcast. So Dr. Good, I'll start with you. I imagine being the Chief Clinical Officer for the American Association of Critical Care Nurses wasn't exactly on your radar when you embarked on your nursing journey. So what led you to this place in your career?
Well, yeah. And hearing that sentence makes me think, oh, that's not really me. So, I started my career as a critical care nurse at the bedside, and probably went into leadership way too early in my career, to be perfectly honest, and fell in love with leadership. And I found that what happened was I shifted my focus from, focusing on that one patient every single day to focusing on my nursing staff to make sure that they had the tools and resources that they needed to take care of their patients. And then I shifted again by a tap on the shoulder, and somebody said, you really have a passion for patient safety and making sure that all patients are, treated equal and have all the right stuff. And so I switched into, patient safety and quality, and then completed my doctorate work. During that time, I also found myself on the board of AACN and eventually the president of AACN. And so when the chief clinical officer position was created at AACN, I thought, man, that is like my dream job. And when Connie, who we all know and love, retired, I thought, wow, that would be just an amazing opportunity. And so that's how I found myself here. And I think it's just a great bringing together of all the different aspects of my career, being able to project the voice of the nurse, at a national level to ensure patient safety through making sure we've got the right tools. And, just looking at the professional development of nurses, because that's my passion, is seeing that light bulb go off, seeing them being able to respond to opportunities. So in some ways, by default, I became the host of the podcast, Voices in Nursing, because they wanted the chief clinical officer involved. But one thing we did differently this year is invited a co-host to be a part of the conversation. And Andrea, that's where you come in. So Andrea, tell them a little bit about yourself, because you have a unique journey as well. I do. Well, first, I just realized literally today that I am now celebrating my 34th year as a nurse.
Wow.
Like, this was the day I took my boards 34 years ago.
Wow.
Which is crazy to think that that amount of time has actually gone by. But I'd wanted to be a nurse actually since I was 5 years old. So my mom worked in a doctor's office, and based on how old I am, they actually let you go to work with your mom sometimes. So I would go sit there and for whatever reason, like, I fell in love with that environment. And I can tell you, after 34 years, I've made the right decision. I know that 100%. But from the time that I started my career, I was always in a fast-paced environment. Outside of my obligatory first year of med surg, I did ER, cath lab transport, critical care, and I loved that adrenaline rush from it. But I discovered through that trajectory, my true passion was really educating others. And I really wanted to help people develop the skills to help them succeed. And so I pursued my master's degree in nursing education, and I really wanted to focus on staff development. So I got involved in AACN about 20 years ago, getting my certification, becoming a member. But I did not start volunteering for AACN in 2018. So my ICU had gotten the Beacon Award back in 2015, and we had gotten silver. And I thought, oh, I want to learn more. We want to get gold, right? So I became a volunteer, and I loved it. I love being a volunteer. I stayed doing it till about 2020, till the pandemic. I chaired the task force for the redesign of the new Beacon program. And I thought, oh, if a position ever opens up, like, this is my dream job. And then in 2022, a position opened up, and I applied for it, and here I am. And so then how I became the co-host, they actually decided to have auditions. And so we submitted a little 6-minute audition tape, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And I was chosen as the primary co-host. And then we have some backups as well. So it's been really a treat to be able to work with Vicki and get to know her and be in this role.
Awesome. I love knowing, like, the behind the scenes of how things are going on with other podcasts. Like, how did they come about? You know, like, no one goes into healthcare thinking, I want to be a podcast host. Maybe they do now, but I sure did many years ago. And Vicki, you said that I want to circle back to. You said you were tapped on the shoulder. And I think that happens so often. We envision ourselves in one way as a nurse, but other people maybe notice strengths in us and say, hey, you would be good at leadership. We need leaders like you. I was told several times, you're such a good educator. You explain that so clearly. You should be a nurse educator. And I was like, really? I'm like 20 years old. I don't know if I'm the person for this, but the more you hear that and get that feedback from people, you're like, maybe this is kind of how I'm wired and what I would do well at. And what do you know? I actually enjoy this stuff. Maybe I should pursue this, even though it's pivoting different than what I thought I was going to be doing. Yeah, we need good nurse educators. We definitely need some good nursing leaders that are making an impact on what's happening on the front line. So I love hearing y'all's backstory about how you kind of pivoted in this direction. And then one other thing I wanted to say, this is just like a honest confession. To be very honest, as an educator and a podcast host who loves telling stories to teach critical thinking, I have a little podcast name envy. Like, I love the name Voices in Nursing. That is the coolest podcast title. Why didn't I think of this? It evokes so much of what I want my podcast to be as well. Like, I want nurses' voices amplified. I want to learn from and be inspired by other voices in nursing. What, like, inspired the creation of this particular version of the AACN podcast? What are the stories that you're hoping to bring to light with the podcast?
I mean, our podcast has gone through an evolution. So, first we started the podcast during COVID to really respond to those just-in-time needs that nurses across the United States had. But then we shifted it into a leadership series and focused on leadership. But what we quickly found is there's more than one way. You don't have to have a title to be a leader.
Yeah.
What we found was people were thinking, oh, that leadership podcast doesn't belong to me. And we didn't want them to have that feeling. And so the one thing that we know is the voice of the nurse has to be resonated across multiple different audiences. And so that's our whole goal, is how do we bring light to the multiple facets of nursing that are out there and how those different individuals are making a difference in the lives of patients.
That's good.
I really think they can see themselves in our guests because they do these projects, and sometimes nurses get great ideas and they're afraid to take it to the next level. But, these nurses started out as staff nurses too, and what they've done is nothing short of amazing. So
right.
I hope it gives people hope that they can do that too.
I remember when I was I don't want to say just. I wasn't just the staff nurse, but I wasn't charge nurse yet. And they asked him to be charged. And I was like, I don't know if I'm like a charge nurse material. And my boss said, Sarah, leader has nothing to do with what's on your badge. You have been a leader since you started in this department. People look to you as a resource. You just have a calming personality. You are a leader, whether you have the title or not. But we would like to give you that title because we need a charge nurse. That's kind of what it comes down to. I was like, okay, I guess I will step up to the plate and have the official title. But she's like, you've been leading for a while. And we just didn't have the title yet. So yeah, leadership is not a title. It's influence.
You touched on one of the words that I absolutely dislike. Nobody is just a nurse.
Right.
And so, we had to get that word just out of our vocabulary because every nurse has a voice and every nurse has a purpose in what the work that they're doing.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, so let's talk about the podcast itself. Can you share an example of maybe like a clinical guideline or an AACN practice alert that changed how care was delivered at the bedside and maybe what impact that it's had?
I think one of the biggest things was one of our original podcasts, which was actually prior to Voices in Nursing. And that's when AACN recognized the fact that when the COVID task force was appointed, there was not a nurse at that table. And so AACN went and advocated and said, a nurse must be at this table. And so one guest that we did, or we had on our show was John Gallagher, who was that nurse that was at that table. And to hear his behind the scenes and what they went through, in developing those guidelines and the scrutiny and the public perception and all that kind of stuff was just so fascinating. But he was one of the critical elements in setting the national standards for how to take care of COVID patients. And many people don't realize that the AACN was the one that advocated to make sure the voice of the nurse was present for that.
Hi, thanks for sharing that. I have to go back and check that episode out. I'd love to hear the behind the scenes going on there. How about you, Andrea?
I feel like there are so many. It's hard to pick from one. Some of them may not have turned into an AACN practice alert or a clinical guideline. However, I think there's so many that could be taken by any nurse and bring that to their leadership at their organization and say, I heard this podcast and I feel like this would be a fantastic thing that we could implement on our unit, especially if it's something that resonates with them, then maybe they're having an issue on their unit. So some of the things that I can think about are, there was one on empowerment. There was one on bullying. We had one on something called the last responder. And, that's not a term that we're very familiar with in nursing. And so it really dealt with end of life and, death and dying. And it brought up things that as a nurse, we don't think about and we haven't actually been taught. And so I feel like if they listen to any of those, they could take those ideas and then bring them to life in their organization. And there's so many more. I just can't name them all.
Yeah. Well, I've listened to all of the Voices in Nursing episodes so far. And in listening to them, a thread that I picked up on was the importance of listening to nursing intuition and how that can and should inform our care as well. Can you speak to that a little bit? I get this question a lot, actually, from nurses is like, what is this whole elusive nursing intuition? How do we, quote, develop it? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and it kind of brings you back to that question of how much of it's developed and how much of it's present when you go into the profession. Because I think we all have a sixth sense occasionally on, different things. I also think that there is a certain amount of development to it. We get it as we gain experience. We get it as we participate in professional development opportunities. We get it as we network with each other. So, when we start learning from each other and being open to listening to one another, I think we start to develop that bank of experiences that maybe we didn't have, but we brought them in from other people.
Right.
So, the networking is so incredibly important. And oftentimes, some nurses don't realize the power of networking.
Okay. What about you, Andrea? You're an educator. How do you teach that?
Well, I think intuition, just like critical thinking and clinical judgment, you have some intuition and you've got some critical thinking. You don't necessarily have clinical judgment when you first come out, right? So if you think of Benner's novice to expert. When you first come out and you're first learning, you're so black and white and you're very rule driven. And you're almost afraid to trust your intuition.
Right.
But I feel like if you've got the right preceptor and what your gut told you, when you realize it was right and somebody validates that for you, then the next time you're more apt to say, okay, you know what? What I just saw before, I'm going to carry that with me, and I'm going to know that I'm going to be able to recognize this next time. And then that just builds upon itself. And so that's positive reinforcement for your judgment and your critical thinking. And, throughout my time as an educator, especially new grads, but also experienced nurses too, I would do a lot of various things with critical thinking, whether it be scenario driven or case studies. But as I evolved as an educator, I was very fortunate to work at a place where our director of education was very pro trying new things and active learning. So I really got into the gamification space, and that changed a lot because that active learning really helped people develop some of those skills, whether it be clinical judgment or critical thinking or trusting their gut. So whether that was a low fidelity situation or a high fidelity situation with a mannequin and games, that really made a huge difference in growing the staff to the next level.
I agree. I think you both hit on this point very well in that it may be a little bit like intuitive inside of us as we become nurses, but with time, with experience, we can correlate, okay, that gut feeling plus this clinical presentation equals this diagnosis, we need to move, right? And I think that we can almost amplify or accelerate that ability if we are working alongside other nurses and taking time to listen to their stories. We can learn from their hindsight wisdom, their great catches, their near misses, their mistakes, their victories, all the things. If we actually talk to each other and listen to the other voices of nursing, sorry to use that pun, because we can learn so much from each other. I think about, I chair the Code Blue committee at my hospital. And so I get to see all the Code Blues that happen in the facility, and I get to learn from all of those charts. And all of we saw this code come and we saw the changes in vital signs and I apply that to my practice. Or oh my gosh, we didn't see this coming at all, but maybe we could have if we would have paired this lab value with this vital sign, we could have predicted, so I take all that knowledge and apply it. And with time, for me, 21 years as a nurse, now I get that gut feeling and I know, okay, that plus I'm looking for the other signs. Whereas before I would just be like, I don't know, vital signs are fine. My gut says something's up, but vital signs are fine. As a new grad, I didn't know how to trust that intuition. But like you said, with a good preceptor who can help you hone in on that, can help you correlate the two. Okay, remember that feeling you had plus those modeled needs, we should be concerned. That feeling you had plus that patient scared look in their eyes, we should be advocating. And so teaching nurses to kind of trust that intuition and speak up and advocate because of it and not wait for the vital signs to be the only indicator of patient decline is super, super important.
You just hit on something as well with not just looking at, just the vital signs, other indicators, but it made me think of something else, and that's trends.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times I would focus on what have the trends been, especially when you're looking retrospectively at something. What were the trends with the blood pressure, with the labs over time, over the last 8 hours or the last 12 hours? Because sometimes there's little things in there, right, that maybe we could have acted sooner. And so using those as a way to develop that skill set, and where is your comfort and trigger point for then taking the next step and calling somebody.
The other thing that I go back to is we had the honor of interviewing Sarah Rosati, and she has done some amazing work in the AI space on predictive analysis of when a patient is going to go bad.
Mm-hmm.
And we've all heard of the Muse scores that we have embedded in our medical record. But oftentimes, the challenge with those is, if you don't get the charting done on time, it doesn't pick that up. Well, what she has found is that some of that intuition stuff that drives a prediction of when a patient's going to go bad. And her tool looks at things like how many times have we called the physician, and some of our narrative charting of those little subtle signs. And they can predict a patient deteriorating 24 hours in advance. So it's not something that's like 30 minutes in advance. So she's able to take AI and get it in our brains and figure out, what are those key things that a nurse's intuition looks at to predict how well a patient's going to do.
Yeah.
So she's got some amazing AI work.
It is exciting to see us in the forefront with AI. I think my initial tendency is to push back against it, but if we could maybe partner with it for it to help us advocate for patients, I'm here for that. That sounds amazing. Even in my own hospital, we do have Muse. We do have that option.
Right.
But I'll tell you, it can kind of be a wide net that catches almost too many fish. But what is more precise, more specific, is that nursing intuition piece or like nurse concern. And so we've added not just Muse for proactive intervention, but also give us a call if you're concerned. Give me a text to put a patient on our radar, Yes, the vital signs are fine, but you just feel like they're breathing weird. I'll come check it out. Yeah, their vital signs are fine, but you feel like their eyes look different than yesterday. They're talking differently than before. Yes, let's investigate that together. And I'll tell you, we have caught so many patients that way where the Muse would have scored perfectly, but the nurse knew something was up and couldn't quite put their finger on it. And so again, all of those times has also added to my intuition development. It's like, okay, this nurse is onto something. They've been with this patient. They feel that gut feeling. And then now we're starting to have to dive deeper in the chart, dive deeper into our assessment findings to figure out what's the source of this change in their status. Yeah, great points.
And not only that, but the family's intuition, because the family knows this.
Yes.
If a family looks at me and says, Dad just doesn't look right and he's not acting right, my ears and eyes perk up because I'm like, wow, they might know something that, I'm a guest in their life at this point as a nurse.
Absolutely.
And these people know, that patient constantly. But I agree. I mean, AI is scary, but I think if we can embrace it and we can support nurses that are leading this research and nurses that are developing these algorithms, it can be incredibly powerful moving forward.
Yeah. What was the name of the first episode where you guys interviewed the patient and I want to say his daughter about their experience? That one was beautiful. I was like tearing up driving to work. Like, why am I crying? Such a beautiful story, though.
I know. I went into that episode saying, I'm not going to cry. I'm not going to cry. And one thing I know, I'm crying. It was Mr. Dorman and his daughter, Abby. And it was just a beautiful experience. And it originated by a Daisy letter. And Bonnie Barnes from Daisy reached out and said, this letter is beautiful. Is there a way to amplify it? Because it really expresses their gratitude for critical care nurses. And I'm like, well, let me figure out the best avenue to, get this out to our members and to our community. And so then we were designing the podcast at that time. And I thought, oh, what a powerful podcast to really be able to give nurses a voice and be able to give a family the ability to express their gratitude. And it was amazing. And he actually was our guest at our first ever Daisy breakfast at NTI. So it was great to meet him in person and his daughter. And they're just a lovely, lovely family.
Yeah. Definitely brings us all back to the heart of like why we're doing what we're doing. Like, yes, I love the sciencey, nerdy stuff and all the gadgets and human dynamics, but I really do it because I love being with people in hard times and to hear their story, how their family went through that together and how nurses impacted their experience. That was a great kickoff episode for Voices in Nursing. Okay, so back to the whole intuition thing. Like with all of that in mind, how do you balance both evidence-based practice with real-time decision-making in high-pressure situations that happen to arise in critical care? Because we have to kind of like incorporate it all together. There's often not time to like sit back and ponder my intuition for a while. We have to just like feel it and act. Mm-hmm. How have you guys learned to do that in your many years as nurses and as leaders, as educators? And that's a hard question.
Well, I can just say, my own experience, obviously repetition and seeing things over and over again definitely helps, right? We talked about that before where you're building on something you've seen. And that will happen with every new grad, the more they're exposed or a nurse who's transitioned from one area to another as he or she grows in that next skill level. But one thing personally that I've done is I've always been into taking a real life situation that occurred on the unit, right? And taking that as a learning and taking, okay, how could we have done this differently using evidence-based practice? And how could we have recognized things differently? But I also have done where we're looking at a potential situation that can occur. So, for example, I love using game shows for clinical decision-making, reality type TV shows.
Put the pressure on a little bit, like in real life.
Yes. So I'd done one called Surviving Patient Emergencies. I had created it with a coworker at my previous job. And the whole thing was drilling down on situations, but using images of what something could look like, or sounds or different clues. And the nurses actually had iPads where they could interact with what was going on. And that helped them so much when it came to emergency situations. I've also done, as an example for the critical care staff, I had done an escape room on a patient who had a very bad day. So they had a carotid endarterectomy, and then they developed a hematoma, and then they had a stroke. Then they had a, airway emergency, right? But that is a potential situation that could literally occur.
Yeah.
And it's something so rare that you never see. So how are you going to deal with that? And so drilling down from everything from what that assessment looks like, from sounds and sights, all the way to what the heck is in that emergency cart and how are we going to use it?
Andrea, my educator heart is just saying like, amen and amen. Yes, please, no more death by PowerPoint. Let's apply the clinical knowledge to the actual patient scenarios, not just like multiple choice answers. Like, no, the patient's in front of you. They have 3 problems happening at once. Where's the cart and what's in it? That's, to me, a much more valuable way of educating staff nurses.
The other thing is try not to have assumptions. And what I mean by that is that sometimes in critical care, for example, you see your A-line waveform on the monitor. And sometimes everybody's like, oh, it's just sort of been like that all night. It's not working. Well, how do we know it's actually not working, right? How do you know that this waveform hasn't really changed? Because there's actually something wrong with the patient. And so we actually had one. I walked in, they were like, can you help us fix this? And I was like, that just doesn't look right. I said, let's go get the textbook. Let's go get the book and look at the different waveforms. I said, I think this is something else. And sure enough, we opened it up and I'm like, it looks like cardiogenic shock. What's going on with the patient? And there were all these other signs and symptoms, but it was this assumption that the A-line was broken.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important to not make assumptions, to dig deeper and further if you can.
That's good. I agree. How about you, Vicki? What are your thoughts on integrating evidence-based practice with intuition and high-stress situations?
Yeah, well, and I mean, I think given my patient safety background, I think that's critically important because there's always the rules we should follow, right?
Mm-hmm.
But most of those rules, if you look at them, they're guidelines because not every patient is going to fall within that parameter. And, guidelines are written to serve 80% of patients. And so really take into account, what needs to be done at that moment may not necessarily follow the guideline. And so pulling in that intuition and what needs to be done. But I think the other thing that's critically important is using opportunities as learning experiences. So, when something goes wrong, don't be defensive. Let's go back and drill down and figure out what happened, what went wrong. Were there signs that we should have responded to? And then how do we learn from that and spread that learning, throughout our unit? So that's the whole thing is it's got to be both. It's got to be that intuition and it's got to be those evidence-based practice, guidelines that we put in place at the same time to take care of patients because all patients are unique human beings and they don't respond according to the textbook all the time.
Darn it. That would make things so much easier, but way less fun.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, I love it. I agree with you guys completely. Yeah, I wanted to add to whenever I respond to emergencies, and it maybe came from an error. Maybe there was oversight on the nurse's part or a wrong med was given or a med should have been given and wasn't for whatever reason. I think the nurse tends to want to hide that. Oh my gosh, I made a mistake and not tell anyone, not expose it. But man, what a great opportunity for us to grow personally and for every other nurse we work with to be elevated in the care they can provide if they kind of knew behind the scenes what went on. Mistakes, unfortunately, they do happen. They do happen. We are human. I don't think any nurse that I've ever worked with intentionally harmed a patient. No one. We all have good intentions. And so when I respond to these emergencies where there's been maybe an error, I always start with, let me tell you about a time that I made a mistake. Afterwards, when I'm debriefing with others, let me tell about my time, just so they know, like, listen, we all make them, okay? So tell about my time when I mixed up an antibiotic. And then I say, tell me what maybe you've learned from this experience. Like, if you could go back and do it again, like, how could we have caught this? What would have gone differently? Let them kind of share that. And then I say, well, here's the deal. I'm allowing you 5 minutes of beat up time. You can beat yourself up for 5 minutes, and then I'm cutting you off. And then we're transitioning from beat up time to learning time. And I really encourage you to share this with other nurses. Like, that's hard to do, to admit that we are human and we make errors.
Right.
But if you can share it with someone else, that means that nurse gets better and won't do this ever again. Obviously, you're not going to do it again. You learned from this experience, but then they won't do it either. We can all learn from like the gaps in the system and the opportunities for error and like how we can prevent them next time. Please share it. I know I am constantly talking. I mean, I have a whole podcast, some about great wins and great catches, and also episodes about like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I missed this patient was having brain bleed. Like I've had these moments as well. And I want to share my errors so that, again, that intuition continues to build. We can keep supporting each other and building that like database inside our minds about signs of patient decline and things we can do better to be excellent as bedside nurses. So about y'all's podcast, I'm curious if you could recommend one episode. I mean, hopefully they'll listen to all of them, but if they only got time for one tomorrow, which episode from your show would you recommend and why?
Well, you kind of took one of mine away, meaning the Dorman family. But I would say my close second is Virginia Allen. She is one of the last living Black angels. And if you don't know the Black Angels story, I highly encourage you to go back and listen to that. But she shared her journey of taking care of TB patients back in the day when many nurses, white nurses, said, nope, I'm not going to do it. And a group of nurses of color stood up and said, we will go take care of these patients. And so Virginia is in her mid-90s now, very active in philanthropic work. And I'm not sure I could keep up with her schedule at her age, even today at my age. But it was just so insightful to listen to how they were instrumental in the research in tuberculosis medications and treatment, and how they handled isolation procedures back then when, we didn't have disposable masks and disposable gowns, and how they made things work.
Right.
It was a very inspiring episode, and highly recommend the book as well.
All right. You guys heard it. Check it out. How about you, Andrea? Which one stuck out to you that you think you should watch and listen to?
Well, this was also hard for me to pick because I do believe that all of our guests shared amazing stories of projects that they had initiated or had been a part of. And our guests have really made an impact in their organizations or beyond for the greater good. But the one that resonated with me on a personal level was episode 10 with Dr. Shalonda Perkins. And it was about from bullying to belonging and how to change that culture. So she used her experience working in a hostile work environment to create this whole evidence-based strategic initiative to create a culture of respect in nursing. And when I first got into nursing, I was a byproduct of being bullied as well. And I resonated everything she does in her podcast about feeling sick and not wanting to go to work. I had those same symptoms, and it makes you want to run and hide. Now I feel like I don't want that to happen to people, and yet it's still happening, right? And so she gave some really good strategies on how to drive change in your organization. And that is something that could start at the unit level. And so I really feel like nurses could benefit from that.
Yeah, that's not the stuff I learned in nursing school. Like, they just told us nurses, if they're young, be prepared for it, but no one told me how to, respond to it. It was just suck it up and keep going. It gets better.
Right.
But yeah, you're right. That's a great topic, and I'm glad that there's podcast episodes about it, and I'm glad that her organization exists to support nurses and shift this culture forever. I'm sick of this nurses at your youngest culture. Okay. And then what's coming next for your podcast? What should we be excited about?
Oh, the list is quite hefty there. And, the Sarah Rosani episode that I spoke about a little bit earlier on AI and her research work is just incredibly inspiring because she started out as a staff nurse with a simple question. And now she's doing nationally funded research in this, particular environment. So it really demonstrates how you can use that voice at a very, very small level and then how it can blossom into just amazing work. So when that one comes out, I think it is definitely a must listen.
Okay. All right. Can't wait. And then how can nurses and healthcare professionals get involved with AACN or maybe contribute to your podcast?
There's a million different ways to get involved with AACN. One, making sure that you pick the right professional home, whether it's us or somebody else, is so critically important to your own professional journey. But, we have a volunteer database, so you can go in and fill out your volunteer profile and say, I'm interested in design of an ICU or, leadership or whatever you're interested in. And then we search that database constantly for volunteers for a variety of different projects that we're working on. So, come speak at our national conference, speak at our virtual conference. I mean, there's just so many different ways. Author in one of our journals. The other thing is we want to hear from people. Who do they want to hear from on the Voices of Nursing podcast? If they've got recommendations, email Andrea and I, or we also have a dedicated email, podcast@aacn.org, that you can write in and tell us, here is a great story. Please, give voice to this.
That's awesome. Okay, if you guys are okay with it, I'll put your emails in the show notes so people want to reach out to you and say, I have the best story that needs to be amplified. They'll know how to get a hold of you guys.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, closing question. As you guys reflect back on your many years as nurses, I would love to hear both a piece of bad advice that you got and what is the best advice or wisdom that you might want to share with my listeners. I'll start with you, Andrea.
Oh, I have to think on the bad advice for a second, but I will say from a good advice or wisdom. And I feel like I had a lot of good preceptors, but I think when I really got into the education realm, I feel like I had really good mentors that always said, and this goes back to intuition, I think, trust your gut. You follow your gut, and usually it's right.
Yeah.
And if it's wrong, you don't feel bad about it because at least you did everything that you were supposed to do. It's the times that you don't listen to it because you're afraid or you don't trust yourself that you will beat yourself up if something bad happens. So what's the worst that's going to happen if somebody makes the wrong call? Nothing, right? So just do what you feel is going to be best in that moment. That I think is something I took with me, and then I continued to teach. And that actually just brought me up to the bad advice. The memory literally just popped into my head.
Perfect.
So when I was working in the ER many, many years ago, so this is like the early 90s, we had a patient who came in and they were very, very short of breath. And the nurse who was above me, I was just starting to become the charge nurse. So I was really getting mentored in that aspect. And she said, oh, you know what? She is an alumni. She comes here all the time. She just is anxious. Just put her in the waiting room. And I was like, I don't think so. Something feels so wrong here to me. She just doesn't look right. But this nurse was a stronger personality than me. I felt like I was backed into a corner. And I said, okay, you're going to go in the waiting room. And I just was like a nervous wreck. And you know what? I should have trusted my gut because that bad advice of putting that person in the waiting room because she was just a repeat customer and was just anxious. She had a PE, she coded, and she died.
Oh my gosh. Woo.
Yeah. So from then on, I was like, you know what? I will never, ever, ever make assumptions that someone is just anxious, whether they've been here 100 times or it's their first time, because there's usually a reason for it. And then you know what? Until I can figure out that it truly is anxiety, I'm still going to treat you as if you have a physiologic problem. So that piece of advice, I would say, don't let the person who seems to have more experience make you go against what your belief is.
Yes, that's good, Andrea. That'll preach right there. How many patients have I cared for that were both anxious and having a critical illness because I'd be anxious too if I had a PE and I couldn't breathe. Like that's a normal expression of when you can't breathe. Of course they're anxious and they also have major something we need to be paying attention to. Yes, thank you for sharing that. So take advice from your mentors unless the advice is to excuse your patient's concerns and not validate what they're going through and maybe like downplay that intuition. Don't listen to that advice. True. That's a good one.
True story.
I love how I love how your good advice and bad advice go like hand in hand. That's good. All right, Vicki, how about you? What's some bad advice? What's some good advice that you want to share?
Mine goes hand in hand as well. And the one bad advice was be quiet. You're just a nurse. And it's like, in the mid 80s when I started, don't add up those years, but, nurses didn't have a voice as much. And your mentors would tell you, well, the doctors don't want to hear about that, or, administration doesn't want to hear about that. And that never sat well with me. And so that was the bad advice. And then I would say, my dear mentor, and unfortunately she lost her battle with breast cancer, but she was the one that was probably influential in me getting into national organizations and leadership positions, because she looked at me and said, the sky's the limit and you can do anything you set your mind to. And so I just continue to think back on that. I can do anything I set my mind to. And don't let self-defeat dictate where you are able to go.
That's good, Vicki. Listeners, hear it from the chief clinical officer of the AACN. Like, don't sell yourself small. You can do big things. It's hard to envision yourself in these big positions making huge impacts. But I think that your story is testament to that, Vicki. So yes, thank you for sharing your mentor's advice with all of us.
Can I add one more thing to the new grad piece and intuition, et cetera? One thing I always told every new grad that I ever taught and onboarded is that when you have the feeling that something's bad, especially in the middle of the night, please, please, please do not ever feel bad calling the doctor and waking them up, right? They knew what they were getting into when they went to med school. They knew they were going to be on call. They knew they were going to get up. Do not feel bad about it. And don't not call because you're worried about getting yelled at, because you've got to do the right thing for the patient.
Yeah.
And you're the only one who's there and who can advocate for that patient. So that's just a morale boost for you.
Yes.
To go get them and go do it.
That's right. Right. They work for the patient, the doctor, and we work for the patient, right? I don't work for the doctor. And so if my job is to advocate for this patient, then that means I might have to wake up a doctor or a few. And I'm doing my job, and then they have to, in return, do their job, which is respond to my concerns and respond to the patient's needs and order what's necessary. So yeah, it is a collaborative effort. Do not say sorry for having to wake you up. Just say, thanks for taking my call. Let me tell you about my patient.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, amen. Amen, Andrea. Well, guys, it has been so nice talking to both of you. It's been just such a pleasure to get to know your backstory, both in your personal careers, but also how the podcast came to be. Thank you so much for joining me and sharing your stories with my audience. I have just loved speaking with you both. So thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you for having us. It was our pleasure.
Oh, absolutely. So audience, if you have enjoyed this conversation and you want more stories from the edge of the bedside, interwoven with clinical wisdom and deep professional reflection, then go ahead and subscribe to the Voices of Nursing podcast, and I will put a link in the show notes for you. So thanks for tuning in today. Stay sharp, stay curious, keep honing that skill of listening to your intuition so that you can keep showing up for your patients and your team. Till next time. Before you go, I have an exciting announcement. You can now earn CEs for listening to this podcast. That's right. Our Renegade has teamed up with podcast hosts like me who are delivering amazing content that not only educates, but inspires you to be the best for your patients. You get to learn and earn continuing education credits while absorbing knowledge from thought leaders and innovators in the field of health and medicine. You're already listening to podcasts during your commute, at the gym, or while unwinding after a long day. So why not earn your CEs at the same time? And that's where pod classes come in. Yep, it's just what it sounds like. It's CE learning through podcast. To learn more, I put a link in the show notes for you. Well, thanks for listening. I hope you learned something that will save a life. Remember, nursing is a team sport, so trust your intuition and don't give up advocating until you are confident you've done what's right by your patient. The views and opinions expressed on this show are that of Sarah Lorenzini's. That's me and mine alone. They are not intended as medical advice and should not take the place of your institution's policies or procedures. Evidence-based practice is ever-changing, and your patient care should reflect the current best practice. So if you want to get in contact with me, you can shoot me an email at sarah@rapidresponsern.com or on all social media platforms as The Rapid Response RN.